Good evening, everybody. I might have a few issues with technology tonight, but don't worry. We're here to pay tribute to Andy Peebles. Now, because I couldn't get John Heaton, because I couldn't get John Heaton, because I can't read out this obituary for you, I've had to do it via artificial intelligence. So if the voice is a little bit wooden, believe you me, it's a lot better than my voice, as well you know. I'm sorry, but I'm not one of these audio book readers. But anyway, listen, here we go. So I'm going to put this on for you. Let's just have this one more time. Book of the Dead.
Andy Peebles obituary. Pop radio DJ and presenter who recorded one of the last interviews with John Lennon in December 1980. Anthony Hayward. Monday the 24th of March 2025, 13:09 GMT. Andy Peebles, who has died suddenly aged 76, was for 14 years a disc jockey on BBC Radio 1, where he presented shows across the schedule, switching between mornings, afternoons and evenings. In 1981, 3 years after joining Radio 1, he settled into a Friday evening spot with a program combining music and a preview of the weekend's sporting action. "I never dreamed that I'd get to talk to all those incredible people," he said in a 2017 Radio Today podcast to mark the station's 50th anniversary. Ian Botham was about to become a worldwide star, Billy Beaumont was just about to lead his English rugby team to a Grand Slam, Kevin Keegan, great character, was at the forefront, captaining the England football side. But the interview with which Peebles had made his name, in December 1980, was with the former Beatle John Lennon, who had just released Double Fantasy, his first album in 5 years. With his second wife, Yoko Ono, Lennon spent more than 3 hours talking to Peebles at the Hit Factory recording studio in New York, before they and the BBC team spent several more hours eating at a Mr. Chow restaurant. The star spoke about the breakup of the Beatles a decade earlier. Once they gave up touring, the occasional session in a recording studio had just become a job. Acknowledged for the first time that Yoko was co-writer of his solo hit Imagine, and enthused about making future LPs. Asked about his privacy and why he had settled in New York, Lennon said, "I can go right out this door now and go in a restaurant. Do you want to know how great that is? Or go to the movies? I mean, people come up and ask for an autograph or say, hi, but they won't bug you." 2 days later, on the 8th of December 1980, as Peebles flew home, Lennon was fatally shot by Mark Chapman outside his apartment at the Dakota Building next to Central Park. The DJ said he turned down offers of grubby money from tabloid newspapers to discuss his meeting with Lennon, but he broadcast a tribute on Radio 1 with John Peel alongside him. The interview then ran in the 5-part series John Lennon, 1940-80, which began a month later and was followed by a full transcription in the book The Lennon Tapes. Another highlight of Peebles' time at Radio 1 was traveling to Moscow in 1979 to present the station's exclusive live broadcast of a concert by Elton John, one of the first staged by a pop act in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The broadcaster described the visit as terrifying, with the BBC team constantly followed by KGB officers. "We are talking about walking around a city which in architectural grandeur terms was extraordinary to behold," he recalled, "but in reality I spent the whole time, as did most of our party, looking over our shoulders." The interview ran in the 5-part series John Lennon, 1940-80, and was followed by a book, The Lennon Tapes. Peebles was born in London, to Mary née Simmons and Robert Peebles. His father, a head postmaster, died when Andy was 11. On leaving Bishop Stortford College, a private school, he trained in hotel management and catering at Bournemouth College of Technology, now Bournemouth University, starting in 1967, just weeks before Radio 1 was launched, sounding the death knell for the offshore pirate stations of which Peebles said he was a massive devotee. After showing his own talents as a DJ at a college dance, Peebles was hired to work at the town's Samantha's and Chelsea Village discos, then in London, at the Scotch of St James nightclub, and Manchester, at the Hard Rock. This led in 1973 to a job at BBC Radio Manchester. A year later, he moved across the city to one of Britain's first commercial stations, Piccadilly Radio. Andy Peebles was among Piccadilly's founding broadcasters and, while there, started presenting Soul Train, a show that he took through his career to different stations. When he came to the attention of Radio 1, Peebles began at the BBC in London with a weekday evening show in 1978. The following year, after a short run on The Breakfast Show, he switched between afternoons and mornings over the next few years until his daily shows ended in 1981 and he began his long-running Friday evening program. At Radio 1, he also presented the weekly magazine show Stayin' Alive, 1979-82, as well as My Top 12, 1981-83, and its successor, My Top 10, 1984-92, with rock stars picking their favorite music. He also revived Soul Train at weekends, 1987-92, and made special programs on Paul McCartney, Elton John and David Bowie, an interview recorded in New York during the weekend of his Lennon meeting. Like most Radio 1 DJs, he also hosted Top of the Pops on BBC One, but only intermittently over 5 years, 1979-84. They were mad enough to employ the man who was the perfect face for radio, he said, self-effacingly, I was never comfortable with television. When he was dropped from Radio 1 in 1992, Peebles moved to BBC Radio Lancashire 1992-99 as its morning show presenter, but was back in London at Radio 2 to host the Andy Peebles Soul Show on Wednesday evenings 1997-2002. At the same time, he presented The Late Show on BBC GMR in Manchester 1999-2002. He was then heard on Jazz FM 2002-04, before a long stint on its successor, Smooth Radio 2004-13, then Gold Radio 2013-14, where Soul Train ended its on and off 40-year run. Peebles also worked for the British Forces Network BFBS and the BBC World Service, as well as reporting and commentating on cricket for the BBC nationally and Lancashire Cricket regionally for 27 years. He is survived by his wife, Anne née Swarbrick, whom he married in 2001, his stepdaughter, Sarah, and his sister, Jenny. Peebles was among Piccadilly's founding broadcasters and, while there, started presenting Soul Train, a show that he took through his career to different stations. When he came to the attention of Radio 1, Peebles began at the BBC in London with a weekday evening show.
Yeah, we've had that bit. Listen, I just wanted you to listen to that boring shit because we've got to build up to the John and Yoko interview. You know, the last interview, or one of the last. I think Judy Jewish was actually the last person to interview John Lennon. In fact, she was probably responsible for him dying. But anyway, let's just get on with Andy Peebles for a minute. Now, listen. Now, if you look at Andy Peebles, I mean, he was 30 when he did that interview, about 30 odd, 32. Now, he was a baldy fuck. As he said in his own words, he had a perfect face for radio. Now, why is it that a man as boring and unknown was sent to New York, to the Dakota, to interview John and Yoko? It's because none of the great and famous DJs of the time could have been fucked with it. I mean, it was Paul McCartney, and he wasn't really happening too much at the moment. I know he sort of just had a number one album with McCartney too, but he wasn't, like I said, John Lennon there was no interest in John Lennon, as we know, because Double Fantasy was just shooting down the charts. Nobody was fucking interested. That's why a boring man like Peebles went. But of course, he was the right man at the right time. And as a result of John Lennon getting shot, it also did Andy Peebles a favour, because all of a sudden he was presenting Top of the Pops. He also did the Top 40 show, which is mainstream radio for years. I mean, yeah, eventually the BBC dropped him, and the cause of his bitterness, although he would have known this even from the point of interviewing John Lennon, he would have known all the bullshit. Once he left the BBC, course, he thinks, oh, well, I can still get interviews with Yoko. And of course, she wasn't fucking interested anymore. And the only reason why she called him back while he was working at the BBC was because he'd already put up with her bullshit. And if you're someone like Yoko, you don't want too many people entering into your world of bullshit, because more people are likely to know about it. Maybe she thought Andy Peebles would keep his mouth shut, which he did for years, until obviously the BBC dropped him during that Bannister cull, which was quite funny. Anyway, let's get on with the article from the Daily Mail in 2015 when Andy Peebles had enough and basically said John and Yoko were a couple of frauds. Let's hear it. Part 1.
Dark Truth About Yoko. DJ who secured legendary last interviews with John Lennon reveals disturbing questions about her cynical scheming, her sham marriage and her lover who dressed in stars' clothes. BBC man Andy Peebles interview Lennon and Yoko Ono in 1980. 2 days later, Lennon was assassinated in New York City by a crazed fan. Following the pivotal interview, Peebles struck up a friendship with Ono. Speaking for the first time, he recalls his misgivings about her conduct after Lennon's death, including how she acted with her new boyfriend. It was the rock and roll coup of the decade, the one that every broadcaster was desperate to secure, the first interview for 10 years with John Lennon. And for Andy Peebles of BBC Radio 1, it was a remarkable new high in an already distinguished career. Millions heard his acclaimed Lennon interview in January 1981, made all the more powerful by John's horrific death just 2 days after their recording. The episode would prove to be a turning point, not just in the history of popular music, but in Andy's life too. Indeed, it cast a shadow that has remained with him ever since. Bound by professional obligations to the BBC, as well as a natural sense of discretion, Peebles has never before told the story of the aftermath of his close, if improbable, friendship with John's charismatic widow, Yoko Ono. But today, in a frank and at times emotional interview, he raises a series of disturbing questions about her fame-hungry behavior. He asks, why did Yoko seem much happier after John's death? Why did she parade her new lover Sam Havertoy around New York, dressed in John's old clothes? And why did she appear to exploit John's memory and legacy for personal fame? Peebles fears that John and Yoko, but especially Yoko, manipulated him for the sake of commercial profit. And, perhaps most troubling of all, he concludes that the couple's starting over episode in December 1980 was a sham promotional exercise, designed to restore John's profile after a 5-year absence. He voices both sadness and anger at the BBC for keeping his most famous interview locked away instead of treating it as the public document he had hoped it would be. Peebles had never before met John and Yoko when he flew to New York with his production team in December 1980, to talk about the new album, Double Fantasy. John and Yoko realized that the key to its success was to regain contact with the UK, having walked away after the breakup of the Beatles, because Yoko had been blamed for it. Immersed in controversy and scandal thanks to drug offenses, aware that the Nixon administration wanted him out of America, and terrified to travel home for fear that U.S. immigration authorities would prevent him returning to the States, John had stayed put and parked his musical career. Now he was back on the music scene, promoting the album Double Fantasy, which featured an equal number of songs by husband and wife. And they wanted to talk to the BBC, the broadcaster that John held most dear. Peebles, of course, was a name in his own right. A respected DJ and music authority who spent 13 years at Radio 1 and created the long-running My Top 10, interviewing stars about their favorite records. Yet little had prepared him for his first encounter with Yoko. We had agreed to meet her at the Dakota, the apartment block where she and Lennon lived, at midday on Friday, December 5, Peebles recalls. Even though everything was arranged before we left the UK, we still had to be interviewed by her, to ensure that she wanted to proceed. Their apartment was palatial, gorgeous. We were shown into Yoko's enormous office. She was seated behind an antique Egyptian desk. We were asked to remove our shoes. I remember thinking, thank God I'd put on clean socks. I sat cross-legged on a sofa, and barely said a word. Yoko was opinionated and emphatic. She told us she'd had better offers than the BBC's. The dark truth about Yoko, DJ who was being deliberately provocative. She wanted us to beg for it. Peebles was struck by her appearance in the flesh. At 47, she was small and hard, with a slim figure, but also very busty. What was I thinking as I sat there looking at her? I was thinking, frankly, so this is the woman who broke up the Beatles. She said, right, if we are going to do this, I need to make very clear to you that this interview will be 50% about John, and 50% about me. I felt like saying, who on earth are you? You're the woman who has done for singing what Wayne Sleep has done for rugby league. Nevertheless, the interview the next day was a triumph, concluding with a celebratory dinner. Peebles and his team spent the next day Christmas shopping, and boarded their return Pan Am flight on the evening of December 8. When they were halfway across the Atlantic, assassin Mark Chapman shot Lennon outside his home. Only when the plane landed was Peebles given the devastating news. Perhaps the last thing he could have expected was that he and Yoko Ono would become friends. But soon after the historic interview was finally broadcast in January 1981, he began receiving calls from New York. Drawn together, apparently, by the common love of John, they grew close. Each time a Lennon anniversary approached, it was to Peebles that Yoko turned, insisting that only he was allowed to interview her. He spent private time with her on 3 continents over several years, and came to love the Lennons' young son, Sean. Each time the DJ went to New York, whether for pleasure or on business, such as when Elton John flew him over on Concorde to attend his concerts at Madison Square Garden, he and Yoko would meet up. Whenever Yoko was in London, she'd get in touch. And they talked all the time on the phone. It wasn't long before the scales fell from his eyes, however. He was at first surprised, and then bemused, as Yoko's energy grew and grew. The grieving widow mounted exhibitions around the world, and expanded her profile as a musician. Indeed, she became more creatively active than ever before in her life. It was obvious to me that John's murder was working to her advantage, Peebles says. I was embarrassed and ashamed at some of the decisions she made. She used John's death to hype her own new record, for example, and rushed to record a sentimental B-side compilation of bits of John talking as a souvenir. She compared John's killing to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and herself to Jackie Onassis, insisting that their influence was greater than that of the Kennedys. Out of nowhere, we had Brand Lennon. John would have loathed everything about it. I knew he wouldn't have been comfortable with all that end-of-peer merchandise. He'd have laughed it off, most likely, but he would have seethed with anger inside. A year after the murder, the BBC decided to organize a Lennon tribute. They wanted Martin Bell, the then Washington correspondent, or presenter Sue Lawley, to interview Yoko, but she insisted on Andy. Despite a growing sense of unease about her behavior, he was pleased to have been offered another professional opportunity. Peebles recalls, she used one track on Double Fantasy as I'm Losing You, which John composed and wrote in a 2-hour frenzy, fearful that Yoko, whom John called Mother, had fallen in love with Havertoy. On the same night as John's murder, it is said, Havertoy moved into the Dakota. He barely left Yoko's side for months. But suddenly, Sam took on a new image. Yoko had her young companion dress up in John's old clothes, and wear his hair long, just like John's. It was an impersonation that shocked and embarrassed their neighbors, including ballet star Rudolf Nureyev, who commented on it. Havertoy and Yoko wound up spending 20 years together, far longer than her marriage to John, and separated in 2000. Peebles says, I started asking myself whether she and Sam had been having a relationship before John's death. All the pennies dropped at once. I began to wonder if Yoko had encouraged John to go off and have a fling with their PA, May Pang. May Pang later wrote and published a memoir, Loving John, about their affair, so that she could explore her attraction to Sam Havertoy. My blood ran cold. Had the whole starting over episode, the culmination of which had been my interview with them, been nothing but a charade? Was their happy couple back together and making their marriage work stance all about the product, the album, ensuring that they got a hit out of Double Fantasy? I felt sick. If indeed I had been duped, they were the finest actors on earth, the pair of them. It was Oscar-winning. It convinced me. Peebles has never spoken publicly about any of this before, but feels, finally, at the age of 67, that it is time. It will be 35 years since John's death on December 8. I no longer have any allegiance to the BBC, nor to any other broadcaster. I am still angry, for various reasons. I was never allowed to use any part of my exclusive recordings with John for my talks, or anything else. The BBC profited hugely from my interview and from the tragedy, but I was effectively dispensed with. Also, those interviews should have been made available more openly to the public. They are an important part of our culture, of our history. They should have been respected. 2 years after John's death, Peebles agreed with Yoko to make another program with her in New York. The venue then changed to Los Angeles, and then Tokyo. The production team and I switched our flights, arrived in Tokyo, and there was Yoko with her son Sean and Sam Havertoy. We stayed in the Mampei Hotel in Karuizawa, up in the southern Japanese Alps, deep in the forest. John and Yoko had spent many long holidays at the Mampei. It was utterly magical. The only uncomfortable aspect was that Yoko was now sharing her bed with Sam Havertoy. We were there out of season, and the hotel was closed to the public. Yoko had it opened specially. Staff had been brought in, and fires were lit all over the hotel just for us. She also had local restaurants opened for us. We were the only guests. Why? Because she could, to try and impress me, I suppose. I have to say, she seemed genuinely happy during that trip. She probably was happier, no longer living in John's shadow, no longer part of that relentless Lennon Beatles circus, what's more, able to turn the circus into something that suited her. The bottom line, of course, was that she was just an average Japanese artist who got lucky, and wrecked the greatest band that Britain has ever produced. Sean talked to Andy about John, during long evenings together. Sean had very happy memories of his father, and I was glad about that, says Peebles. I have cried more over him in recent years than about anything. I lost my father when I was 11. A child never gets over the loss of a parent. I knew how he felt. I so wanted Sean to be happy. I wanted him to be loved. He reminded me of myself in so many ways. We'd sit on the sofa together, watching Inspector Gadget, his favorite, and we'd just talk and talk. One track on Double Fantasy is I'm Losing You, which John composed and wrote in a 2-hour frenzy, fearful that Yoko, whom John called Mother, had fallen in love with Havertoy. On the same night as John's murder, it is said, Havertoy moved into the Dakota. He barely left Yoko's side. Like the song on the Double Fantasy that is dedicated to him, he really was a very beautiful. Boy. But by that time, Andy was pretty angry with Yoko. She had been very misguided, by her own ego, by her need to remain important in the context of John Lennon. But she isn't. She is nothing. She is no more than his widow. I would love to have stayed in touch with Sean. I wish I knew why we didn't, although I suspect it was because of her. I got no real buzz from Yoko's efforts to impress me, nor from the fact that she persistently stayed in touch. I knew it wouldn't last, and it didn't. The minute she heard that I'd left the BBC to go elsewhere, I never heard from her again. Copyright 2015 Leslie Ann Jones and Andy Peebles. Like the song on the Double Fantasy that is dedicated to him, he really was a very beautiful boy. But by that time, Andy was pretty angry with Yoko. She had been very misguided, by her own ego, by her need to remain important in the context.
Marie, Marie.
Like the song on the Double Fantasy that is dedicated to him, he really was a very beautiful boy. But by that time, Andy was pretty.
Andy Peebles' obituary. Pop radio DJ and presenter who recorded one of the last interviews with John